It was Emily's wedding night when her grandmother handed her the mirror. A simple gesture, though one wrapped in layers of old family history. This mirror, her grandmother said, eyes hard and knowing, has been passed down through generations. It shows things that are yet to happen. Just be careful with it. At the time, Emily thought it was all part of her grandmother's eccentricities, old stories, old superstitions. After all, the mirror was antique, the glass dull with age, the frame ornate but worn. She didn't think much of it until she noticed the first odd thing. It happened the next morning. She stood before the mirror in the quiet of their bedroom, brushing out her hair after their first night together. She didn't feel alone. It was as though the mirror itself was watching her. When she glanced into it, something was off, something wrong. Her reflection moved. She froze. In the mirror, she saw herself lifting the brush, but the reflection did it a moment before her. Emily looked down at the bristles in her hand, confused. She waited, breath held, and then, yes, the reflection moved again, just a second ahead. Her heart raced, but it was so small, so subtle, that she brushed it off. Maybe it was the lighting, or maybe she was just tired. But the oddities didn't stop there. Every time she passed the mirror, it seemed to show her moments just before they happened. First, the way she'd turn her head, or how she'd reach for a cup. Nothing sinister, not at first. Then, it started with Carl, her husband. She'd see him in the mirror, and something wasn't right. At first, it was small things. His smile would stretch a little too wide, or his eyes would flicker with something unreadable before he even spoke. She'd glance up, and he'd be the same as always, warm and caring. She shook it off. It was nothing, she told herself. But then the things she saw began to change. Over time, Carl's face began to twist in the mirror. It wasn't just subtle anymore, it was unsettling. His eyes would turn dark, hollow, his mouth a sneer. When she'd look at him directly, he'd be the same. But the mirror kept showing her more disturbing images. Sometimes his face would be entirely blank, as though the reflection itself had erased him. Emily tried to ignore it. She tried to tell herself it was just a trick of the light, or some weird psychological effect from too much stress. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. One evening, after years of these unsettling glimpses, she stood before the mirror again, the cold chill of the room biting at her skin. Carl was asleep in their bed, and she was alone, staring at her reflection. It felt like the room itself was pressing in on her, closing the space between her and the glass. When she looked into the mirror, her heart stopped. It wasn't Carl's twisted face this time. No, it was worse. Carl was standing there, just like before, but he wasn't moving. He stood, staring straight ahead, his body still as stone. His eyes were open, but unblinking, staring straight at her, with an emptiness that made her stomach churn. His lips were parted, as though in mid-word, but the silence was deafening. She stepped closer, drawn to the image that shouldn't have been there. Her pulse quickened, her breath ragged. She reached out, her hand trembling as it hovered over the glass. And then a voice, Carl's voice, came from behind her. "I've been dead for years, and you've never noticed." Her body went rigid, a cold sweat flooding her skin. She spun around, heart hammering in her chest, but there was nothing but the stillness of the room. Carl's sleeping form beneath the covers. It didn't make sense. She turned back to the mirror. Carl's face was now completely gone. There was no reflection of him at all, just a dark, empty void staring back at her. She shook her head, dizzy, her breath shallow and panicked. She looked back toward the bed. He was still lying there, breathing softly. But the mirror was showing her something else. It was showing her the future. She watched, trembling, as the reflection shifted again. It showed Carl moving now, but his movements were slow, unnatural, jerky. His limbs twisted, like the puppet of something that wasn't alive, a grotesque marionette. It wasn't him. Not really. She wanted to scream, but her throat tightened, her voice caught. She backed away, heart pounding, eyes glued to the mirror. And that's when the reflection changed again. She didn't know how long she stood there, frozen, watching. But when she saw Carl's reflection, motionless, lifeless, staring at her, she knew. Carl was never really there, not in the way she thought. He had died that night, but she didn't know. She never knew. She had been living with the dead. The reflection showed her now, in horrifying detail, what had happened that night years ago. Carl, lying in the bed, the accident, the crash, the blood. She had married a ghost. The mirror had been showing her the truth all along. But she had been too blind to see it. And when she looked at Carl's face one last time, she saw something new, something that made her blood freeze. A smile, a cruel, twisted smile. The reflection was showing her the end of her story, the moment she would realize, when she would finally know the terrible truth. She felt a hand on her shoulder, cold and clammy, and then Carl's voice, no longer a whisper, now a sharp, cruel hiss in her ear. It's your turn now. The last thing Emily saw, as the room closed in around her, was Carl's face in the mirror, no longer twisted, no longer vacant. He was smiling, and in that smile, she saw herself, a reflection of herself, one step ahead.